Chapter 1. The Man Who Died. Smiling. It was a balmy spring evening at the Bellemare, a sprawling Edwardian manor nestled along the Dorset coast. The estate, with its sloping gardens and weathered stone terraces, had for generations belonged to the Lavington family, ancient money, old grudges, and even older secrets. This weekend, the house hosted one of its increasingly rare gatherings. The occasion was billed as a celebration, Lavington's recent retirement from his role as director of the renowned Wellcroft Institute, a psychological research foundation once famed for its breakthroughs, and now known mostly for its peculiar benefactors and whispered scandals. The guests were varied, a tangle of family, old colleagues, and carefully selected strangers. And though the invitation had promised a weekend of relaxation, behind every smile, there seemed a question left unspoken. Dinner had passed in laughter and excellent wine, but beneath it all was a sense of waiting, as if the guests, though scattered about the drawing room in small, flickering conversations, were listening for something. That something arrived in the form of a scream. It rang out from the study. By the time the others reached the door, Lady Sylvain Lavington clutching her husband's gold-rimmed opera glasses, Dr. Marcus Trelling, and his cane moving with uncharacteristic haste. Eleanor Dacres pausing just long enough to remove her heels, they found Edwin Lavington slumped in the high-backed leather chair behind his desk, his head tilted slightly to the side, eyes wide, mouth curled upward. Smiling. The smile did not fade with death. If anything, it sharpened. Lady Sylvain screamed again. Her voice was high, fraying at the edges. She clawed at the desk, searching for something, anything to make the moment untrue. "He's smiling," whispered Eleanor. Breath caught somewhere between horror and disbelief. It was true. There were no signs of pain, no violence, no sign of struggle. And yet Edwin Lavington was dead. The first to act was Dr. Trelling. He moved forward and, with careful professionalism, checked for a pulse, then gently pressed a finger beneath the old man's jaw. After a long pause, he stood. "Gone," he said simply. Then, almost under his breath, "Heart failure, perhaps. But that smile." It was then that a curious thing happened. Standing in the doorway, half-shadowed by the curtains, was a man who had not been among the weekend's guests at dinner. Small, impeccably dressed, with a mustache that looked carved rather than grown, he wore a dark three-piece suit that had never seen a crease and carried a pair of gloves he had not yet removed. His eyes, though modestly cast downward, missed nothing. He cleared his throat softly. "I beg your pardon, mesdames et messieurs," said Hercule Poirot. "I realize this is an unfortunate moment to make one's arrival known." "Who the devil are you?" asked Dr. Trelling, voice gruff with nerves. Poirot gave a slight bow. "I am Hercule Poirot. Monsieur Lavington requested my presence this weekend. I arrived by the evening train later than expected and was shown into the library to await his notice. I regret I come at the moment of such tragedy." Lady Sylvain blinked at him. You were invited?" "Indeed," Poirot nodded. "It seems, alas, I am too late." He stepped into the room fully now, regarding the corpse with gentle gravity. His eyes flicked to the open window, the decanter of port untouched on the desk, the single note card placed precisely in the center blotter. Poirot's gaze lingered for just a second too long on that smile. "It is not merely a smile, madame," he murmured. "It is a puzzle." From somewhere behind them, a young man's voice snapped into the air. "He was fine all day. He was fine." What could have happened? It was Edwin's son, Julian Lavington. Late 30s, pale, dark curls just beginning to recede. He had inherited his father's broad shoulders, but not his confidence. He was visibly shaking now, fingers clutched around a pocket watch he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Poirot turned toward him gently. "You were close to your father, monsieur." Julian gave a bitter smile. Close? No, not really. He thought I was a disappointment. I gave him plenty of reasons. Poirot tilted his head. Yet you are here. Julian hesitated. Because he asked me to be. Poirot nodded slowly. Just so. It was Lady Sylvain who stepped forward next, seemingly regaining control of herself. Mr. Poirot, I do not know why my husband asked for your presence, but I believe, Poirot interrupted softly. He suspected something dark, something about this weekend. He gestured almost apologetically to the room. The man did not die naturally, mes amis. Look, his posture, too perfect, his limbs, relaxed but staged. The card, the untouched port, the window unlatched despite the warmth of the room. And of course, he glanced again at that strange, unsettling smile. It is not the face of a man who died in fear. It is the face of a man who knew. Silence stretched across the room like fog. Poirot turned slowly, glancing at each person present. Monsieur Lavington, he said quietly, died smiling. And until I know why, none of you shall leave this house. The words landed like a seal upon them, closing the walls of Bellemere's tighter than stone. And somewhere, deep within the house, secrets began to stir. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The storm that followed was not meteorological, but emotional, a pressure system of confusion, suspicion, and unspoken fear. The drawing room had become a kind of limbo. Julian Lavington paced with the nervous rhythm of a man remeasuring old regrets. Eleanor Dacres sat rigid in a wing-back chair, her knuckles pale against the fabric of her skirt, her lips tight with a composure that appeared practiced. Lady Sylvain hovered near the hearth, a crystal tumbler of sherry trembling slightly in her manicured hand. Poirot, meanwhile, remained in the study with the body. He moved like a man inspecting not just a room, but an intention. With gloves now donned, he began at the desk. A fountain pen lay precisely beside a closed notebook. And directly in front of the late Edwin Lavington was the single card he had noticed earlier. White, unlined, and folded once. He picked it up delicately. Inside was a single line, written in a tight, economical script. I forgive what cannot be repaid. Poirot's eyebrows climbed. He said nothing, merely folding the card again and tucking it carefully into a small envelope, which he returned to his breast pocket. Next, he examined the decanter and its companion glass. The port was old, evident in its thickness and the subtle sediment that clung to the bottle's lower curve, and yet the glass poured for Lavington remained untouched. Poirot leaned in and sniffed gently. His mustache quivered. Not poisoned, he murmured, but not served either. A glance at the window followed. It had been opened perhaps 10 minutes before the discovery, judging by the sharpness of the breeze and the undisturbed drapery. The view looked down toward the gravel path that led to the west garden. The latch was clean, no dust disturbed, recently unfastened. Poirot stepped back, surveying the room as a whole. His eyes traveled to the bookshelf, its volumes arranged in irritating asymmetry. A framed photograph stood oddly alone on a high mantel shelf. A young woman, elegant, poised, smiling slightly, almost wryly. He studied her face longer than seemed necessary. Then Poirot exited the study and rejoined the others. I must ask that no one enter that room again until the authorities arrive, he said calmly. In the meantime, I wish to speak to you all privately. Do we not already know what happened? Lady Sylvain asked coolly. You said it yourself. It wasn't natural. So what? Are we to believe one of us poisoned him? Poirot gave a small nod. I do not know yet how he died, madame. Only that he did not die by nature's design. Dr. Trelling, standing near the drinks cabinet with a frown like a storm cloud, interjected. And your expertise in this is? I am a consulting detective, doctor. one who listens more than he assumes. He smiled faintly. Now, if I may begin. They gathered in the smaller sitting room, where Poirot requested each person join him one by one. He took the smallest chair at the desk, spine straight, fingers steepled, mustache immaculately aligned. First came Julian Lavington. He looked exhausted. "You said my father called for you." "Why?" "I do not know exactly," Poirot replied, "but I believe it was for protection." Julian scoffed softly. "From what?" "From us." That would amuse him. Poirot tilted his head. "Tell me, monsieur, how was your relationship with him truly?" Julian looked away. "You want the public story or the private one?" "I would prefer the private one." Julian sighed. He thought I was too sentimental, too weak. I left business school early to pursue painting. Abstracts. He hated it. When I ran into debt, he bailed me out twice. Quietly, of course. Never forgot to remind me. Yet you accepted his invitation. He said he had something to show me, that it would set things right. I assumed he was rewriting the will or handing down some relic. I thought... He paused. I thought maybe it was a reconciliation. Did you see him alone today? Only briefly. He seemed tired, distant but not ill. Poirot made a small note, thanked him, and sent him out. Next was Eleanor Dacres. She entered with a graceful stiffness, as though choreographed. Her blonde hair was drawn back into an elegant chignon, her dress a slate grey that did not invite attention, yet resisted invisibility. "Miss Dacres," Poirot began, "you knew Monsieur Lavington through the Institute." "Yes," she said. "I served as his secretary for 9 years." "And you are no longer in that role?" "No, I left 2 weeks ago." Poirot raised a brow. "Why?" She hesitated. There was a philosophical divergence. The Institute has lost its way. Edwin's vision had become less about research and more about controlling perception. "I see. Did he force you out?" "Not exactly, but he no longer trusted me." "Why not?" She hesitated again. "Because I began asking questions he didn't want asked." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Such as?" "I'm afraid I can't say." "Not yet." He nodded slowly. "And your presence this weekend?" I was surprised to receive an invitation. Edwin wasn't sentimental, but he said he wanted to show me something, to thank me perhaps. I don't know. I came because I felt unfinished. "Did you speak to him today?" "Briefly. He said we would talk properly tonight, that he had laid something to rest." Poirot studied her expression. It didn't flicker, yet beneath it, something unreadable stirred. Third came Dr. Trelling. The man was 60, perhaps older, with a permanent scowl and a sharpness that suggested he trusted only his own mind. He carried his cane like a weapon. "He died of cardiac arrest, most likely," he said without preamble, "unless you think smiling is a cause of death." Poirot gave no reaction. "You worked with him closely?" 10 years. I was the Institute's chief clinical advisor until my retirement last year. Lavington and I didn't always agree, but we respected each other. "Were you invited for professional reasons?" "Hardly. It was personal. I suspect he wanted to discuss a matter we'd argued over in the past. Something about a patient record, I imagine. You seem unsurprised by his death." "I'm a doctor. Death is never far." Yet he left no sign of illness. Dr. Trelling met Poirot's gaze without blinking. People don't always show their wounds. Sometimes they're quite adept at hiding them. Poirot sat back, silent. That, he thought, was a statement with more than one meaning. When the door finally closed behind Dr. Trelling, Poirot remained motionless. He glanced once more at the envelope in his pocket. "I forgive what cannot be repaid." What had Edwin Lavington intended to reveal? And to whom? And why had he died? Smiling. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The following morning arrived reluctantly, as though the estate itself resented waking under such heavy circumstance. Mist clung low over the Bellemere's grounds, veiling its sculpted hedges and weather-stained fountains in a pale, uneasy silence. The manor's staff moved quietly. Curtains were drawn without rustle, teacups placed without chime. The air felt taut, suspended between what had happened and what might still come. In the breakfast room, Hercule Poirot sat with a cup of thick black coffee, untouched toast, and a mind already in motion. He had requested that all of the weekend's guests gather again before noon. Not just the family and colleagues of the late Edwin Lavington, but also the quieter names on the guest list, those who had not spoken much the night before, but whose presence, Poirot now suspected, was far from incidental. The Bellemere's dining room, usually a place of formal elegance, had been hastily transformed into a drawing room of scrutiny. Curtains remained closed, and the fire lit a little too early for the season. Poirot stood near the hearth, posture immaculate, fingers lightly laced. A maid opened the door, announcing quietly, "They're all here, sir." "Merci," said Poirot, then turned to face them. There were 7 assembled before him. He glanced from face to face, pausing just long enough to let the silence ferment into attention. "You're all here because each of you had a reason to be close to Monsieur Lavington," he began, "and because I believe each of you holds a thread of the truth. Some short, some long. Some, perhaps, tangled deliberately." He gestured toward the table. "Let us sit. We must discuss not merely what happened, but who we are and what we have brought with us this weekend, whether by invitation or by design." Chairs scraped the floor softly as the guests obeyed. Poirot remained standing, moving slowly as he addressed each in turn. Julian Lavington, seated near the fireplace, wore the same clothes from the night before. Creased now, his collar loosened. He looked not disheveled, but undone. "The son," Poirot said gently. "An artist by inclination, a disappointment by perception, oui? But one does not come merely for reconciliation, not when there is an inheritance in question." Julian flinched. "You think I came for money?" Poirot made no answer, only turned to the next. Lady Sylvain Lavington, regal even in mourning black, her jewelry muted, her lips colorless, but pressed firmly into dignity. Poirot inclined his head slightly. The widow. Not a woman of tears, but of strategy. "You said last night that your husband was in perfect health?" "He was," she said curtly. "He had the constitution of an ox." "An ox rarely smiles at the moment of its slaughter," Poirot murmured, then moved on. Dr. Marcus Trelling, seated upright with cane across his knees, offered no expression. His hands were folded, knuckles bone white. "A man of science," Poirot said, "and skepticism, but also a man of ethics. That is what makes you dangerous, Doctor. When a man like you begins to bend his principles, he is capable of very deliberate harm." Dr. Trelling's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. Eleanor Dacre, across from Julian, met Poirot's gaze steadily. Her composure had not lessened, but her confidence seemed to have shifted inward. More guarded, less poised for battle. "Miss Dacre," Poirot said, "the confidant, the former assistant, one who perhaps knew Edwin Lavington's secrets better than he did. Yet you said he no longer trusted you." "He didn't," she said simply, "but that doesn't mean I wanted him dead." "No," said Poirot, "but it does mean you might have known who did." He turned now toward the more overlooked members of the group. Vivian Hargrove, Edwin's goddaughter, a quiet figure with striking green eyes and a whispery voice. She had spoken barely a word since arriving, though Poirot had noted how often her gaze wandered to the doors, the windows, the exits. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "you were very close to Edwin Lavington in your youth, were you not?" She nodded. "He helped raise me after my parents' accident." "And yet," Poirot said. Your seat at dinner last night was the farthest from his. I didn't want to cause trouble. Why would your presence cause trouble? He asked gently. She looked down. He and I hadn't spoken in years. Giles Morton, a barrister and trustee of the Lavington family's financial affairs, was next. Polished, calculating, perhaps too aware of himself. Poirot had not yet spoken with him alone. You have handled the family's interests for decades, Poirot said. That puts you in a position of access, does it not? To documents, to trusts, to things that others might assume are sealed. I've always acted with integrity, Morton said flatly. Of course, said Poirot, but the appearance of integrity can be a very clever disguise. Finally, Cecily Venn, the newest addition, young, sharp-featured, and inscrutable. Introduced as a research assistant from the Institute, she had not been expected at the weekend until the very last minute. She had not spoken much, but Poirot had observed the way she watched each person like a student preparing for an exam. Mademoiselle Venn, Poirot said, you were not on the original guest list. She smiled faintly. Mr. Lavington invited me privately, just 2 days ago. Curious, Poirot murmured. One might think he needed you to witness something. Or to keep something hidden. She didn't respond, but her hand briefly tightened on the back of her chair. Poirot stepped back now, surveying the circle. You see, mes amis, what intrigues me is this. All of you came expecting something. A revelation, a transaction, a reconciliation, and yet now, none of you receive it. Because the one man who knew the truth is gone. But, Poirot added, I do not think the truth has left with him. It lingers, in gestures, in letters, in the small hesitations in your voices, and that, I promise you, is where I shall find it. He let the words settle like dust on old furniture. Then he looked to the butler at the edge of the room. Please arrange for the guests to be escorted to their rooms. I will speak with each of them again, in time. As they departed in ones and twos, Poirot remained in place, watching. One pair of eyes lingered a second longer than they should have, watching someone else, not Poirot. Vivian Hargrove, turning back, had been staring not at Julian, not at Lady Sylvain, but at Cecily Venn, and Cecily had seen it. Poirot smiled ever so slightly. Yes, he thought, the web is already trembling. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. Though he had technically arrived the night before, Poirot's presence at Bellemere's had been no grand entrance, more a quiet insertion into chaos. But now, as the day ripened and the house adjusted uneasily to the weight of the previous evening's death, the famed Belgian detective was ready to assert himself more fully. With the local police still en route, summoned dutifully by the house's valet but hours behind schedule due to a train derailment in nearby Southampton, Poirot knew the window was open, and like all good investigators, he intended to use it wisely. By mid-morning, Poirot requested access to Edwin Lavington's private quarters. Lady Sylvain reluctantly agreed. Gesturing to the upper west wing and dispatching a maid to unlock the study's inner chambers. Poirot did not hurry. He ascended the grand staircase with measured steps, pausing now and then to study portraits and hallways as if they might whisper the past to him. Hastings would have remarked that Poirot took the steps as if each one were a clue in itself. At the threshold to the late Mr. Lavington's suite, Poirot removed a delicate handkerchief from his pocket and used it to turn the doorknob. The air inside was faintly metallic and still. The room was tastefully smitten, dark cherrywood furniture, heavy curtains, and a writing bureau positioned directly beneath a mounted photograph of the Wellcroft Institute. A single book lay on the bed, closed but face down, Studies in Mental Suggestion by Professor Everard Lessing. The spine was cracked, the margins marked with faint pencil strokes. Poirot took note of a particular annotation. Contradiction sans exposure. never reveal guilt in sequence. He turned slowly, scanning the surfaces of the room. There was order here, yes, but of a compulsive variety. Pens aligned perfectly, cufflinks in ascending size, shoes facing east in their box. Poirot murmured aloud. The man lived by rules, and yet someone played a different game. He moved to the wardrobe. The suits were arranged by shade, from dove grey to charcoal. Hidden beneath a false bottom drawer, Poirot discovered a thin manila envelope, carefully tucked between outdated insurance statements and an old passport. He pulled it free. Inside was a letter, unsigned, typed on Institute letterhead. You cannot control what you cannot erase. I know what you did. I know who paid for it. If you go through with the announcement, everything will come out. Some debts do not forgive. Some truths survive. There was no date, no sender, only a ghost of a threat and a promise of exposure. Poirot folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his inner pocket. He turned next to the desk. The top drawer was unlocked. It contained a collection of guest lists, all for this weekend, some annotated in Lavington's sharp hand. Julian, final chance? Eleanor, cannot trust her. Trelling, Rose-me truth. Vivian, necessary to witness. Giles, safeguard the paper. Cecily, must observe. Poirot tapped the paper gently. Final chance, safeguard. Cannot trust. These were not dinner party reflections. These were psychological assessments, intentions. He closed the drawer. His lips were pressed into a line. Downstairs, he found the suspects dispersed through the house. Lady Sylvain in the music room, polishing a cracked string on the grand piano, with gloved hands. Julian and Eleanor seated far apart in the morning room, not speaking but clearly aware of each other's presence. Trelling near the garden, smoking alone. Cecily Venn pacing the library, stopping intermittently to inspect the titles, not reading them, and Vivian, curiously, not visible at all. Poirot decided to begin with the one most eager to remain unnoticed. He found Vivian Hargrove in the greenhouse. The glass panes were fogged from the inside, and vines curled through open lattices like green fingers. She stood at a central table, trimming dead leaves from a cluster of white orchids. You do not strike me as a woman at ease among orchids, Poirot said gently. She jumped, but did not turn. I didn't realize I was being observed. You were not. You were merely noticed. Now she turned. Her face was calm, though her fingers fidgeted with a small pruning blade. I didn't want to sit around waiting to be questioned again. And yet, mademoiselle, said Poirot, you have already told me less than you know. Her mouth tightened. What do you mean? Poirot approached the table. You said Edwin Lavington helped raise you. And yet at dinner, you sat at the farthest edge. You've spoken scarcely at all. You were watching someone last night, Cecily Venn. She looked away. Do you believe she had something to do with Edwin's death? No, Vivian said too quickly. Then, I don't know. Poirot tilted his head. Let us suppose he confided in you once, something old, something dangerous, but never told you the full truth. Would it not weigh heavily on your heart to watch him surrounded by people you do not trust? She looked down at her hands. He said something to me. Last year, after a symposium in Berlin, he said he'd made a mistake, that he'd let something go too far. I thought he meant his research methods. He was always walking a moral edge. But then he mentioned a name I didn't recognize. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Whose name? She hesitated. I don't remember, but it wasn't a patient. It was someone inside the institute. Did he say what he intended to do? He said he was preparing something that would outlive him. I thought he meant a book or a paper. Poirot smiled faintly. Perhaps he meant both. Vivian looked up sharply. You think it was one of them, don't you? "I think," said Poirot softly, "that Edwin Lavington had something to reveal, and someone among you had something to lose." He left her in the greenhouse, walking slowly back toward the manor. In the foyer, Cecily Venn was waiting. Her eyes were sharp now, no longer playing the part of my assistant. She said nothing, but handed Poirot a folded sheet of paper. "He gave this to me," she said. "Right before dinner, told me not to open it unless something happened." Poirot opened the paper. Inside was a diagram, abstract, like a mind map, scrawled in black ink and branching like a tree. At the center was one word: observation. Around it, debt, witness, forgiveness, inheritance, control, exposure, and circled twice, smile. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Did he say what it meant?" he asked. Cecily shook her head. "Only that everything would depend on whether people told the truth when no one was watching." Poirot folded the page and tucked it into his coat. "Merci, mademoiselle," he said. "Now, I believe it is time I truly arrived." And with that, he turned to summon the housekeeper. It was time to begin the interviews. Chapter 5. Initial interviews. Begin by early afternoon, the household had quieted into that particular tension which only comes when everyone knows they are being watched, and worse, that they may soon be questioned. The staff kept to the corners, eyes averted. The guests drifted like figures in a stage play between drawing rooms, reading corners, and sunlit halls, their movements polite but charged. Poirot, having reviewed his observations and compiled a mental inventory of expressions, omissions, and contradictions, requested that each guest be brought to the small study off the east wing, an intimate room lined with old atlases and soft leather chairs. There, with the door shut and a notebook before him, he would begin what he considered the most delicate art of all: listening. The first to be summoned was Lady Sylvain Lavington. She entered with the precise elegance of someone who had once stood beside statesmen and foreign dignitaries. Her black mourning dress was understated but unmistakably expensive. She sat without waiting to be offered a chair. "Let's get on with it, Monsieur Poirot," she said coolly. "I've already told you what I know." Poirot nodded. "Indeed, madame, but this time I ask not for what you know, but what you felt." Her mouth thinned. "Felt? What do feelings have to do with murder?" "A very great deal, I assure you." She sighed, but complied. "I felt relief, if I'm to be honest. Edwin had been declining in ways no doctor could quite name. He grew fearful, paranoid, secretive. I hardly recognized him this past year. Yet he summoned you to this gathering." "Oh, yes. He insisted I come. Said it was imperative that the family be present. That truth required witnesses." He was always dramatic. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "What kind of truth?" "I assumed it was about the Institute, some scandal, or perhaps his precious will. God knows he revised it often enough. I stopped caring after the fourth version." "Did you see him alone before the dinner?" "No. He stayed shut in that blasted study all afternoon. He sent notes with the housekeeper." Poirot paused. "Was there anything unusual about your marriage, Lady Sylvain? Financial entanglements? Separate interests?" She raised an eyebrow. "We hadn't shared a bedroom in over 10 years, monsieur. Does that answer your question?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It does." He thanked her. She left without a word, her perfume lingering longer than her patience. Next came Julian Lavington. This time, Poirot motioned for him to sit directly across, close enough to observe his hands. Julian appeared fatigued, his eyes rimmed with sleepless red. "I've already told you I didn't kill him." "I do not assume such things," Poirot said gently. "But tell me, monsieur, what do you believe he intended to say to you this weekend?" Julian ran a hand through his hair. "I thought he was going to finally acknowledge me, not as a failure, as a person." He offered no hint of this supposed forgiveness. Just a note. Said he had something private and binding to share. Said he'd explain it all after dinner. Yet dinner passed, and no explanation came. Julian nodded. He stood, raised his glass, and said, "Tomorrow changes everything, that's all." Then he retired to the study. I thought, his voice cracked slightly, I thought he was going to make amends. Poirot leaned forward. "Tell me, monsieur, did you need the inheritance?" Julian looked down. "I needed something, not money, something to prove I wasn't a mistake." Poirot observed the quiver in his hands. "Guilt or grief, or both?" "Merci," he said softly. "That will be all for now." The third guest was Giles Morton. He entered briskly, lips pursed, his leather satchel still in hand. "I suppose you want to know about the estate," he said before sitting. Poirot gestured. "By all means." "There were 2 wills," Morton said. "One executed 3 years ago, the other, unsigned, discussed last week in confidence. Edwin was planning to shift the bulk of his wealth into a charitable trust under the Institute's umbrella. He said it was time to ensure his life's work would not be diluted by heirs." Poirot blinked. He planned to disinherit his son? Not entirely, but dramatically. Julian would have received a modest annuity. The rest was earmarked for projects he refused to detail. Something involving research access and reparations. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Reparations? That was the word he used. "Did anyone else know?" Morton hesitated. "I believe Dr. Trelling may have suspected. He and Edwin argued last week, loudly. You witnessed this?" "Only the aftermath." Poirot nodded. "And the unsigned will, do you have it?" "It's missing." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "I placed it in Edwin's desk drawer myself," Morton continued. "When the police examined the study, I expect it will not be there." "How curious," Poirot murmured. "Merci, monsieur. You have been most helpful." Fourth to arrive, Eleanor Dacre. She looked composed, though her voice carried tension. "Do you believe he was poisoned?" she asked without preamble. "I believe he was silenced," Poirot replied. "Possibly before he could deliver something dangerous." Her gaze held steady. "Then you understand the stakes?" "Perhaps, but I wish to hear what you know." Eleanor folded her arms. "There was a file, a confidential dossier Edwin kept on the Institute's special cases. Patients with unusual psychoses. He said he had found patterns, clusters of trauma tied to particular experiments conducted in the late 1940s. Poirot's eyes glinted. "Were these experiments legal?" "I doubt it. Edwin once told me that secrets are most valuable when they are shared with the wrong people. That was his mistake, I think. He trusted someone at the Institute to help him expose it." "Do you believe that person betrayed him?" She nodded. "Or silenced him?" "Do you have a copy of this file?" "No, he guarded it obsessively." Poirot's tone grew sharper. "Did he mention a name, someone from those files?" "One, but it's meaningless to me. The name was Dominic Vale." Poirot stood suddenly. "That name is not meaningless." Eleanor looked startled. "You know it?" "I know of it," he said softly. "But the context must be confirmed." He led her to the door. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have given me more than you realize." As she exited, Poirot remained still. Dominic Vale. It was not a name spoken lightly. The pieces were taking shape. Not yet a picture, but a suggestion of something deeper, something old. He stepped back into the room and glanced down at his notebook. Names, motives, silences. There were still 3 guests left to question, and one truth, still carefully hidden. Chapter 6. The first false lead. The afternoon sunlight faded behind a veil of soft clouds, casting the manor into a pale, expectant stillness. Poirot stood near the window of the east study, gazing out over the gardens with his hands lightly clasped behind his back. The interviews had yielded more than enough to stir suspicion, but not yet enough to crystallize truth. That would come, as it always did, in the inconsistencies. He turned from the window as Cecily Venn entered. She moved with a muted precision, closing the door behind her and sitting without waiting to be invited. Her youth did not mask her confidence. There was something sharpened in her restraint, as though she were perpetually calculating her next sentence before the first had finished. "Miss Venn," Poirot said pleasantly, "you have not been at the Institute long, no?" "7 months," she replied. "I was brought on as a data analyst, though Mr. Lavington seemed to have other plans for me." "Other plans?" He spoke of a need for fresh eyes, someone not burdened by the Institute's history. I assumed he meant the direction of his current research. Poirot sat across from her, watching the flicker of calculation behind her expression. "You mentioned before that he handed you a note on the night of his death. Do you know why he trusted you with it?" Cecily hesitated. "He believed that no one else in the house was neutral." Poirot gave a slight smile. "Are you?" She tilted her head. "I wasn't close to him. I wasn't close to anyone. Perhaps that made me useful." He nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you were watching everyone last night. From behind books, through open doorways. You watch people, mademoiselle, like a woman looking for proof." "I study patterns. That's my nature." "Then let us study one together," Poirot said, rising. "Would you join me in the study where Mr. Lavington died?" She followed without a word. Inside, the room was just as it had been left. Closed, untouched, the armchair still drawn slightly back from the desk. Poirot moved to the fireplace, gesturing toward the note still secured in his pocket. "You recall the line he wrote?" he asked. "I forgive what cannot be repaid." Cecily nodded. "Curious phrasing," he mused. "Forgiveness is not often the language of researchers. Of guilt, yes, but not of logic." She moved closer to the desk, frowning slightly. "You think he was atoning?" "I think he was preparing to confront someone. Perhaps more than one. And that someone did not want to be exposed." Cecily's gaze flicked toward the floor. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "There was a file, a list of patients, of unethical trials, of data falsified or buried. He planned to share it this weekend." "I never saw such a file," Cecily said slowly. "No," Poirot agreed. "But perhaps you saw its consequences." She met his eyes. "I saw Eleanor Dacres the night before last, outside Edwin's study. She didn't know I was passing through the hall. She was holding a folder, thick, bound with a green ribbon, the same one I saw Edwin use for confidential files." Poirot inhaled sharply. "You are certain?" "I recognized the emblem on the cover, the old Wellcroft insignia." "Did you see what she did with it?" She slipped it under her coat and disappeared into the west wing. Poirot gave a short nod. "Merci, mademoiselle." As she left the room, Poirot remained still. A line had been drawn. If the file truly existed, and if Eleanor had taken it, then the motive for Edwin Lavington's death may have just narrowed. But he required confirmation. That evening, under the guise of requesting a second interview, Poirot invited Eleanor Dacres once more into the study. She entered warily, lips pressed into a thin line. "You said you had no copy of the file," Poirot began without preamble. "I don't. But someone saw you with it." She paled slightly. "I didn't take it," she said. "I found it. Edwin had left it, intentionally, I believe, on the table in the library 2 nights ago, almost as if he wanted it to be seen." "You concealed it beneath your coat?" "I panicked. I didn't know who else might see it. I took it to my room to read in private." "And did you?" She hesitated. "I began to, but I stopped. It was worse than I imagined." Poirot waited. There were patient testimonies, she said slowly. Descriptions of experimental methods, treatments, some bordering on torture, and references to something else. Something Edwin called the Veil Protocol. Poirot's voice was quiet. And where is this file now? I put it back, she said. The next morning, I returned it to his private desk drawer, the one in the study. But it is no longer there, she swallowed. Then someone else must have taken it after me. A lie, or truth poorly timed. Poirot studied her a long moment. She did not break his gaze. "I believe you, mademoiselle," he said at last. "But that belief, you understand, may yet shift with the facts." As she left, Poirot turned to the hearth. There, tucked behind the firewood cradle, was a scrap of ribbon. Green, frayed at the edge, and very much like the one Cecily described. Poirot picked it up. It had been burned. Later that night, just as Poirot prepared to retire, a knock came at his door. It was the butler, pale and slightly breathless. "Sir, I think you should see this." He led Poirot down a narrow hallway off the servants' quarters. There, near the boot room, a waste bin had been overturned. Among the ashes and charred pages lay the partial remains of a file. Edges singed, lettering visible only in broken fragments. "Well inst. Case. Domin. Attempt 1949. Outcome. Suis. Poirot knelt, silent. He did not need the rest of the words. Dominic Vale had not died cleanly, and someone had just tried to erase him again. But whoever did this had made a fatal mistake. Because they hadn't destroyed everything, and Poirot had seen enough to recognize a false lead and the hand that placed it. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The fire in Poirot's room had been left to smoulder low, yet the detective stood fully dressed by the hearth, the half-burnt ribbon in his hand, and a glint in his eye that suggested thought, not rest, was his chosen companion tonight. The false lead had not surprised him. Indeed, he had been waiting for it. The act of destroying the file, or at least making it appear as though it had been destroyed, revealed more about the murderer than they intended. It was not just a move to erase evidence. It was an emotional decision, a desperate one. And desperation always left fingerprints. After a brief conversation with the butler, whose recollection of the waste bin's usual contents confirmed that it had been emptied the day before, Poirot returned to the main drawing room, where a low lamp still glowed. To his mild surprise, he found Dr. Trelling seated in one of the armchairs, sipping brandy alone. His cane rested across his lap, and his brow was furrowed in a way that suggested private calculations. Poirot did not ask permission to sit. He lowered himself into the opposite chair and gave the doctor a courteous nod. "You are not a man easily rattled, doctor," Poirot said lightly. "Yet you sit here like a man measuring the weight of ghosts." Trelling's smile was slow and thin. "You have a poet's tongue, Monsieur Poirot. I merely enjoy silence more than conversation." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet silence, when it follows death, is rarely peace. It is the moment the mind fills in its own answers." Trelling glanced at him. "Are you suggesting I'm imagining things?" "I suggest only that you are remembering them." For a moment they sat in the low firelight, two men surrounded by shadows. Then Poirot added in a quieter tone, "Dominic Vale, that name, it returns, n'est-ce pas?" Trelling did not flinch, but his knuckles whitened slightly on the cane. "I was not the one who conducted those experiments," he said at last. "That was before my time. Vale was part of a psychological adaptation project, early post-war work. Edwin brought him in for observation. Something went wrong." "You believe he died by suicide?" Trelling hesitated. That was the official record. "But Edwin, he always implied more happened, that the Institute buried something." Poirot studied him carefully. "And you never asked questions?" I was a physician, not a historian. He downed the last of his brandy in one smooth motion. I tried not to get involved in the politics. Poirot smiled faintly. A curious thing, Doctor. Those who avoid politics often become the pawns in them. Without waiting for a reply, he stood. Bonne nuit, Doctor. Sleep if you can. The next morning, Poirot began his game in earnest. He had requested that breakfast be served buffet-style in the East Conservatory, a sunlit space surrounded by glass and creeping ivy. The choice was deliberate. There, among mirrors and bright morning light, people could be seen without distortion. He arrived just as the others began to gather. Vivian Hargrove, in a pale cardigan, looked wan and withdrawn, but her eyes darted between Julian and Cecily as though tracking something unsaid. Julian, hungover and sullen, spoke to no one, while Cecily appeared composed, but Poirot noted she poured her coffee before filling her plate, an unusual choice for a woman of calculated order. Poirot made no announcement, no dramatic speech. Instead, he began quietly, conversationally, speaking first to Lady Sylvain. "It is strange, madame, how people sit in rooms," he said. "Even strangers seem to know instinctively where not to be." She gave him a dry look. "Rooms? What does that have to do with anything?" Poirot gestured subtly around the conservatory. "Last night I noticed something during dinner. Mr. Lavington had placed each guest precisely, Julian at one end, Giles Morton beside him, Eleanor across, and you at the head. But one seat, near the center, had been moved slightly. Only slightly. Just enough to suggest it was repositioned after he had arranged it." Lady Sylvain sipped her tea. "I fail to see the significance." "But I do not," Poirot replied. Someone feared being too close to him or too far from someone else. He turned next to Julian, who looked up with weary suspicion. "You moved your chair, did you not?" Julian looked startled. "How do you know?" Poirot smiled. "Because you are left-handed. The teacup on your place setting had the handle pointed to the right. Yet when I returned to the table after everyone had gone, the saucer bore a faint ring. On the left side." Julian hesitated. "I didn't want to sit where he put me. That's all." "Why?" "Because he always positioned me like a child, at the end, at the far end. And yet," Poirot mused, "perhaps he wanted to keep you far from something, or someone." Now, with the table quiet, he turned to Vivian Hargrove. "And you, mademoiselle, you arrived late to dinner, yes?" She nodded nervously. "And you took the only remaining seat?" Vivian's voice was small. "Yes. Yet you looked uncomfortable. Your eyes flicked constantly to Cecily Venn. Why?" There was a pause. Then softly, "Because I've seen her before." The room went still. Poirot leaned forward. "Where?" "At the Institute. Months ago. She wasn't a staff member then. She was being interviewed. I saw her arguing with Edwin." Cecily stood abruptly. "That's not true." Vivian flinched. "It is. You were wearing a red scarf." "You shouted something about owing the truth, I remember." Cecily turned pale, but her expression remained defiant. "He changed his mind. He brought me in after that to monitor data sets." "Or," Poirot said calmly, "you were brought in to keep something out of public view. Perhaps you had knowledge of what the file contained." Cecily's jaw tensed. "I didn't kill him." "I have not accused you," Poirot replied. "But your presence here was not, as you claimed, accidental." A long silence followed. Then Cecily sat back down, her fork untouched. The psychological game had begun to stir the threads, each guest now watching the others more carefully, each calculation interrupted by a new question. Poirot rose from the table, smoothing his cuffs. "There will be more questions," he said gently, "and fewer lies." As he walked from the conservatory, he heard the murmurs begin, and in those murmurs, Sharp, subtle, and fraying at the edges, Poirot heard something else too. Fear. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The Bellemires' estate had taken on the air of a haunted gallery. Its guests no longer moved freely but watched doorways before passing through them, spoke only when necessary, and smiled with the tightness of those who feared being overheard. After the breakfast confrontation in the conservatory, a fresh tension hummed through the halls, and Poirot, ever watchful, knew that fear had begun to do its quiet work, fear of exposure, of memory, of being next. Late that morning, Poirot requested a walk through the gardens. Not for leisure, of course, but to observe. Eleanor Dacres joined him, as if on instinct. The two moved past sleeping roses and half-sprung hedges toward the smaller western path that curled behind the greenhouse. Eleanor, though silent at first, soon broke the quiet. "I don't think Cecily lied," she said softly. "But I do think she left something out." Poirot inclined his head. "As have we all, no?" She gave a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so reasonable." Poirot looked over his shoulder toward the house. Fear does not often make us unreasonable, but it does make us selective. They turned the bend and came upon the side entrance to the greenhouse. The door, curiously, stood ajar. Poirot paused, then stepped inside. The scent of damp soil, citrus leaves, and fertilizer pressed against them. Everything seemed undisturbed, except for a clay pot tipped on its side and a trail of footprints leading toward the back workbench. Poirot motioned Eleanor to stay by the entrance and advanced slowly. On the bench, tucked beneath a drying cloth, was something unexpected. A teacup and saucer, perfectly clean, and beside it, a vial. Poirot examined the label, smudged but partially legible. Ethylene. He frowned. "Ethylene glycol," he murmured. "Antifreeze." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You think someone was poisoned?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He sniffed the rim of the teacup, then nodded once. "There is no sweetness left now, but the scent is faintly chemical. If this was used, it was recent, and it was subtle." They exited quickly. Back in the manor, Poirot summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Anstridge, a woman with a memory as exact as her apron creases. "Madame," he said gently, "who last requested tea outside of regular breakfast or dinner service?" Mrs. Anstridge blinked. "I believe Miss Hargrove asked for some yesterday evening, sir. Around 7:30. I sent it out to the greenhouse as she'd gone walking after supper." Poirot's brow furrowed. "And did she drink it?" "She returned the tray herself. Said she hadn't touched it. Wasn't feeling well." With that confirmation, Poirot returned to the drawing room and requested that Vivian Hargrove join him. She arrived looking tired but alert, as if some part of her had expected to be called. "I'll tell you now," she said before he could speak. "I didn't drink it." Poirot nodded. "Tell me everything." "I went to the greenhouse to think. I hadn't been sleeping and I wanted somewhere quiet. When I got there, the teacup was already waiting, but I didn't touch it. I felt uneasy. Something about the smell. It reminded me of paint thinner. I left it there and walked the grounds instead." Poirot studied her carefully. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I wasn't sure, and I was afraid you'd think I was making it up, but now I'm glad I didn't drink it." Poirot exhaled softly. "So am I." But even as she left the room, Poirot's mind had already begun turning again. Someone had tried to poison Vivian Hargrove, not murder her, perhaps. Ethylene glycol in small doses could sicken, confuse, create distraction rather than death. So the question was, why? He returned to the greenhouse and had the teacup sealed and stored for police testing. Then he visited Edwin Lavington's desk again. This time, he took greater care with the cabinet drawers beneath. Many locked, but one left slightly ajar. Inside, Beneath a pile of outdated research notes, he found something overlooked in the earlier search. A letter. It was addressed to a Dr. R.C. Vale. Not Dominic, as previously suggested, but Richard, a relative perhaps, or an alias. The letter was dated 6 months prior. You must understand that I never intended for the protocol to reach human trials. The board overruled me. I believe the consequences were far greater than any of us admitted. I intend to speak out soon, but I need you to confirm what happened to patient 4. You told me he was stable. You told me he survived. I no longer believe that was the truth. Poirot stared at the final line. There is still time to tell the story honestly, before someone else decides to end it for us. That changed everything. If Edwin had planned to contact a veiled descendant, or confessor, that meant the real story of the protocol had never come out, which made Edwin not just a symbol of guilt, but a threat to someone still invested in silence. Returning to the lounge, Poirot found Cecily Venn reading near the fireplace, a book open, but clearly not being read. He approached calmly. "Mademoiselle, may I sit?" She nodded, closed the book, and set it aside. "I must ask you again," Poirot said, "what your true connection to the Institute was, before Edwin brought you on staff." She stared into the flames. "My father was a junior researcher in the late 40s. He left the Institute abruptly. I never knew why, but 3 years ago, he died. Among his things, I found letters. One from Edwin. It alluded to something called the Veil Protocol. I didn't understand what it meant." "And so you contacted him?" "I demanded answers. He agreed to meet. He told me very little, only that mistakes had been made and that someone wanted those mistakes forgotten. He offered me a position. Said it would let me see the inside." Poirot nodded slowly. "You were watching them all." "I was trying to find the pattern. And did you? I think someone still believes the old secrets can stay buried, even if it means burying someone else." Poirot stood. "Then let us ensure no one else is silenced." Outside, the clouds had darkened again. Rain licked the windows in a whisper, like breath drawn before a storm. Another crime had surfaced, not to obscure the first, but to warn away the truth, and to Hercule Poirot. That meant only one thing. The murderer was not content to kill once. They were still playing the game. And the end was not yet written. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. By late afternoon, the corridors of Bellemere's echoed with the kind of silence one usually hears in hospitals or empty theaters, thick, charged, and heavy with anticipation. Poirot moved deliberately through the house, his mind circling the same spiral. Someone had poisoned a cup of tea not to kill, but to send a message. Someone had burned the edges of a file, not to erase it, but to appear as if it were gone. These were not acts of rage. They were rehearsed movements, performances meant to mislead. The murderer was not hiding from Poirot's eyes, but daring him to look too closely. He began with the timelines. Poirot returned to Edwin Lavington's desk, this time laying out a chronological map. He listed each guest's arrival, cross-referenced it with when Edwin was last seen, and marked any unexplained absences. One detail stood out. Between 5:30 and 6:15 p.m. on the night of the murder, Giles Morton had not been accounted for. The others had all been seen. Eleanor in the library, Lady Sylvain in her rooms dressing for dinner, Julian in the garden, Cecily and Vivian, each in separate hallways. But Giles? Absent and silent about it. Poirot found him in the sunroom, reading a newspaper that looked too crisp to have been actually read. Giles lowered it as Poirot approached. "Still chasing shadows, Poirot?" he asked, with a smoothness that tried to sound amused, but didn't quite mask the discomfort underneath. "Only the shadows that hide men's truths," Poirot replied calmly. "You were not seen between 5:30 and 6:15 the evening Edwin died. Where were you?" Giles folded the paper slowly, buying time. In my room. Making a phone call. To whom? My secretary? I asked her to look for a contract I'd left in my office. It's nothing to do with this. Poirot's expression remained polite, but unconvinced. And yet you did not mention this earlier. I didn't think it mattered. On the contrary, every silence has its weight, Monsieur Morton. Giles shifted slightly. You think I poisoned the tea? Set fire to a file? I'm a barrister, not an assassin. Poirot nodded faintly. Then you understand better than most how motive disguises itself. He did not wait for a rebuttal. He had no need to prove guilt yet, only to press against the mask and see what trembled. As he stepped back into the corridor, a memory struck him, the way Julian had handled the teacup the night of the murder. Earlier, Poirot had examined the tray brought to Edwin's study and found it oddly placed, set on the far left side of the desk, almost out of reach from the armchair where the body had been found. That suggested the cup had either never been touched or deliberately avoided. But perhaps more curiously, it suggested that someone else had placed it there. He found Julian in the billiard room, alone, chalking a cue but not playing. The man looked up quickly, guilt flickering behind his eyes. You've got more questions, I assume? Julian muttered. Poirot inclined his head. Only one, for now. Did you bring your father his tea that evening? Julian blinked. What? No, why would I? Poirot moved closer. Because the staff were occupied. Because the housekeeper was elsewhere. Because someone delivered a cup that Edwin never touched. Perhaps it was a gesture, a son trying to please a father on the night of a long-awaited conversation. Julian looked away. I didn't bring him anything, and he wouldn't have wanted me to. He was still furious about the Venice debacle. Poirot waited. Julian exhaled sharply. All right, fine. I brought it in. But it wasn't meant to be secretive. I just thought maybe if I did something small, something thoughtful, he'd start the conversation he'd promised. Poirot's voice was soft. And did he? No, he barely looked at me. He said, wait in the drawing room. I have one more thing to arrange. And that was it. I left. When I came back later, he was gone. Poirot studied him. Did you pour the tea yourself? Julian frowned. No, I just carried the tray. It was already prepared when I passed the pantry. That pointed the trail not to Julian, but to whoever had prepared the tea. Poirot returned to the kitchen and summoned Mrs. Anstridge, the housekeeper. She appeared promptly, expression composed. Madame, Poirot said gently, on the night of Edwin Lavington's death, who prepared the tea on his tray? She thought a moment. It was the new kitchen maid, Florence. First week on duty, I instructed her directly. She asked if she should bring it herself, but I told her to leave it in the pantry since Mr. Julian was nearby. Was anyone else in the kitchen at the time? Cecily Venn passed through once, asked for a cloth to clean her spectacles, but she was only in the room a minute. Poirot nodded. That 1 minute could have been all it took. He found Cecily moments later in the drawing room. Her face was pale now, a faint flush beneath her cheekbones. She was staring out the window, but not at the view. Mademoiselle, Poirot said, his voice even, you told me you never entered the pantry, that you had no direct contact with Mr. Lavington's belongings. I didn't, but the housekeeper saw you there, the evening of the murder. Cecily's lips parted slightly, then closed again. Yes, briefly. I needed a cloth. Poirot stepped closer. You handled the tray? No. The cloth, the tray, the vial found later in the greenhouse. It is too neat, too consistent. That cup was never meant to be drunk. And yet it contained traces of poison. She shook her head. I never, perhaps not to kill, Poirot interrupted softly, but to weaken, to confuse, to disorient, so that what followed could seem natural, or worse, inevitable. There was a pause, long and uncertain. Then she spoke in a whisper. I was trying to protect someone." Poirot said nothing. Finally, she looked at him. He said he was going to expose them all. My father was among them. He worked at the Institute. Edwin said he had documents that would ruin every name on that list. I thought, if I could stop the reveal, just delay it, maybe I could bargain with him. Ask him to redact my father's name. He said no. He said it had to be everything or nothing. "So you tampered with the tea." I thought it would just make him tired. I thought I could reason with him afterward. But when I returned, the door was locked. Poirot watched her closely. "You returned?" She nodded slowly. "At 8:10. Just after dinner. But he was already gone." This was no confession of murder. But it was something. A confession of interference, a thread of guilt, and perhaps a false sense of cause. Poirot left her there, watching the rain slide down the windows. Some connections had now come into view. Cecily's father, the Vale Protocol, the file, and the attempt to suppress it. But one question still burned behind all the others. If Edwin Lavington was not poisoned by Cecily, or if he had not even drunk the tea, then how had he died? And why had he died smiling? Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The evening settled over Bellemare with a stillness that felt almost rehearsed. Rain tapped against the tall windows like cautious fingers, and the lamps throughout the manor glowed softly, casting long amber shadows against the parquet floors. Most of the guests had retreated to their rooms or chosen solitary corners where conversation could be avoided. But Poirot, ever at ease in the quiet hour, moved with purpose. Something had begun to take shape. Not yet a solution, but a silhouette of the truth. There was one clue, subtle and buried, that refused to leave his thoughts. He returned to Edwin Lavington's study, requesting the key from the housekeeper and entering alone. The air in the room had changed. It no longer smelled of death. Only of dust, old paper, and the faint trace of cherry wood polish. Poirot crossed the room slowly, his eyes scanning the surfaces not for what was present, but for what had been touched. He moved to the chair where Lavington had died and stared at the tray once more. The cup had not been sipped. The note had been folded precisely. The decanter of port remained untouched. Every detail screamed of staging, except one. Poirot stepped behind the desk and ran his fingers lightly along the inside edge of the center drawer. There, just beneath the lip, he felt it. A narrow strip of paper, barely visible unless one looked from a low angle. He crouched, reached carefully, and peeled it free. It had been tucked there intentionally, out of sight but not out of reach. A final thought, a hidden gesture. The note was written in Edwin's familiar slanted hand. They will believe what they see. But the truth is in what they don't look for. Poirot's lips pressed together. That line wasn't a confession. It was a riddle. One left behind not out of fear, but out of cleverness. And it hinted at something being omitted, not added. Not a poison, not a weapon, but an absence, a detail others might ignore. His eyes wandered slowly back to the desk, scanning the top again. The inkpot, the pen, the ledger, the blotter. And then he saw it. There were two coasters. One on the right side, where the decanter sat, the other on the left, empty. Except that when Poirot leaned closer, he saw the faintest ring of condensation. Circular, clean, recent. A second glass had been there. Poirot stood upright, heart pacing not from emotion, but from recognition. Someone had shared a drink with Edwin Lavington before his death, and whoever it was had taken the glass with them. He stepped back and allowed his eyes to drift toward the window. It had been left ajar that night. He had assumed it was for fresh air or perhaps opened after death, but what if it had been opened before? To give the impression of solitude, to hide a voice, or, more critically, to allow someone to leave unnoticed. Poirot moved to the window and studied the ledge. Moisture had gathered along the sill, but in the lower left corner there was a partial smudge. Someone's hand, perhaps, gripping the edge to steady themselves. It was not distinct enough for fingerprints, but it had not been there the night before. The fog of the rain would have erased anything left earlier. And so, someone had stood there, possibly climbed out, and if they had done so, where would they have gone? Poirot walked briskly downstairs and into the garden, his umbrella raised against the drizzle. He followed the gravel path around the western side, counting paces until he reached the point just below the study window. He turned slowly, scanning the flower bed. Then he saw it, partially obscured beneath the hedge, a muddy heel print, and next to it, the edge of a handkerchief caught on a thorn. He knelt and plucked it free. It was silk, pale blue, and monogrammed with the initials G.M. Poirot's expression remained still, but his eyes sharpened. He returned to the house without a word and made his way to his own quarters. There, with the door firmly locked, he laid the handkerchief, the note, and the timeline out before him. The picture was growing clearer now, not of a murderer with rage, but of one with precision. Someone who had stayed calm, someone who knew how to appear where they were expected and vanish where they weren't. Someone who understood the subtle mechanics of performance. The handkerchief alone wasn't enough to accuse, of course. Giles Morton would no doubt claim it had been lost days earlier. But when coupled with his unaccounted absence, the missing glass, and the note's implication that perception could be manipulated, yes, it painted a compelling portrait, yet Poirot wasn't ready. Not yet. He needed to be sure of one more thing. That night, after dinner, Poirot made a quiet request to the housekeeper to bring down the guests' luggage. He explained it as a precaution, a matter of inventory in case anything else was missing or moved. The housekeeper, though wary, complied. The trunks and cases were brought to a small anteroom, and Poirot asked for just one item, Giles Morton's valise. He opened it alone. Inside, precisely folded shirts, a tin of shaving soap, and beneath the false bottom, a crystal tumbler wrapped in a linen napkin. Poirot lifted it gently. There was a faint trace of residue inside, undetectable to most, but distinct to him. A film, perhaps wine, perhaps something else, but unmistakably a second glass. And now he had his clue. Poirot wrapped the glass again and placed it back in the case exactly as he had found it. Then he stepped out into the corridor and closed the door behind him. The time for searching in shadows was drawing to an end. Now came the turning of the tide. And soon, very soon, Hercule Poirot would begin his final movement. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The next morning arrived with a grey metallic light. Rain had ceased, but the clouds lingered low over Bellemare like a ceiling too heavy to lift. Poirot dressed with particular care, his waistcoat pressed perfectly, his cuffs starched, his moustache impeccably shaped. The storm, in truth, was no longer outside. It had moved indoors, into the hearts of the guests, and with it came the delicate unraveling that always followed. Today, he would let the suspects fracture themselves. He would simply observe the cracks. At breakfast, the mood was brittle. Vivian Hargrove sat stiffly, barely touching her eggs. Julian, eyes rimmed red, fidgeted with his fork like a guilty schoolboy. Eleanor Dacres offered quiet courtesies, though her voice had taken on a flatness that suggested exhaustion. Giles Morton was notably absent. Cecily Venn entered late, a book in her hand, her expression unreadable. The conversation, when it came, was hollow. Weather, train schedules, the usual false scaffolding built over fear. Poirot, seated at the end of the long table, did not speak at first. He merely watched. And it took only a few minutes for the first blow to land. "I heard someone walking outside last night," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice sharp. Near the west garden, around 1 in the morning. I thought perhaps one of the guests had taken a turn through the hedges. But perhaps it was someone disposing of something. Vivian's fork clattered against her plate. Are you implying it was me? Eleanor didn't blink. You've been to the greenhouse more than once, haven't you? I walk there because it's quiet, Vivian snapped, unlike the rest of this house. Julian gave a low scoff. Or maybe you're still watching Cecily. What is it between the two of you? You look at her like she's holding a knife behind her back. Poirot leaned in slightly, his gaze shifting between them, but said nothing. The table had begun to unravel faster than he'd anticipated. I told you, Vivian said coldly. I recognized her from before, from the Institute. She was there under a different name. Cecily's eyes flicked up. That's not true. You lied about your past, Vivian said. You're not just a data analyst. You're the daughter of Ronald Vale, one of the original scientists. I saw your file. Edwin mentioned you once. He said even ghosts write letters. He meant you. Cecily rose slightly from her chair, her voice still composed but tighter. My father was part of the early team. He left when he realized what they were doing. I didn't lie. I came here to understand, to make sense of what was buried. But you tried to stop Edwin, Eleanor added, turning. You tampered with the tea. You told Poirot yourself, and you only did it because you were afraid his files would implicate your family. I didn't poison him, Cecily snapped, and I wasn't the only one who wanted that file to disappear. Silence fell for half a breath. All eyes turned toward Giles Morton, who had entered quietly just as the accusation landed. He stood by the door, composed, arms crossed. And what exactly do you believe I wanted? He asked calmly. Poirot, at last, stood. His voice cut through the room like the strike of a conductor's baton. Enough, he said. This chaos, this attempt to draw blood from shadows, is precisely what the murderer wants. Confusion, paranoia, suspicion cast like stones into still water. He walked slowly to the center of the room, turning to address them all. I know now that someone entered Edwin Lavington's study before he died. I know they shared a drink, and I know that drink did not come from the glass found beside him. That glass was untouched. The true one was removed and hidden. Julian's eyes widened. You found it? Poirot gave a slow nod. Yes, monsieur, wrapped carefully in a linen cloth, hidden in someone's luggage. He paused, but I shall not reveal it yet. Because I believe this killer, like so many I've encountered, is growing nervous. And a nervous killer makes mistakes. Cecily's voice trembled. Then you still don't know who it is? I know, Poirot said quietly. But knowing is not proving, and proof must be without doubt. The guests stared at one another. Unease thickened. Even Giles looked briefly uncertain. Poirot turned to leave, but at the threshold he added one final blow. Tonight, he said over his shoulder. I shall reveal everything. Until then, I advise each of you to consider one truth. He paused, then finished. The man who died was smiling, but the person who killed him is not. And with that, he walked away. Behind him, the silence exploded into whispers. The game, at last, had begun to corner its player. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The evening at Bellemere's arrived thick with tension, the manor filled with that uneasy quiet that settles before a storm finally breaks. Dinner passed in brittle politeness. Every scrape of a knife, every clink of a glass, rang louder than it should have. Conversations were minimal and pointedly cautious, each guest retreating behind the polite mask of civility, their eyes betraying the deeper current beneath. Paranoia, calculation, dread. Hercule Poirot sat at the head of the table, dignified as ever, eating very little, speaking not at all. He was waiting for the moment when truth would tilt the room. And it came sooner than expected. just after the plates were cleared and coffee was offered, Poirot stood. "Mes amis," he said, voice measured, "I ask you to join me now in the library. We are ready to cross the final threshold." There was no argument. Chairs slid back. Footsteps followed. No one wanted to be the last to arrive. The library was already prepared. A fire glowed behind its wrought iron grate, casting flickering light across the dark mahogany walls. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, facing the great central rug where Poirot now stood, his hands lightly clasped. The others took their seats slowly. Lady Sylvain to the far left, her composure like glass. Julian next to her, twitchy and pale. Then Vivian, quiet and unreadable. Eleanor beside her, arms crossed tightly. Giles Morton, still and smooth. And finally Cecily, whose face was calm, but whose fingers betrayed her with their restless movements. Poirot began without flourish. "This house has become a stage," he said, "and each of you has played your part with admirable skill. Secrets, lies, half-truths, and omissions. These are not new to me. But the tragedy at the center of it all, the death of Edwin Lavington, is not merely a matter of poison or inheritance. It is the consequence of conscience, of a truth too long buried, and a man who could no longer live with its silence." He turned toward Julian. "Monsieur, you believed your father hated you, that you were an embarrassment. Yet he called you here for a reason, not to humiliate you, but to pass on a confession, one he hoped you would understand and perhaps forgive." Julian shifted. He never got the chance. Poirot nodded. "Because someone ensured he would not." He walked slowly toward Cecily. "Mademoiselle Venn, you tampered with the tea, not to kill, but to delay. You hoped to prevent a revelation, one that implicated your father in the earliest days of the Institute's darkest experiments. You acted not out of malice, but fear and guilt." Cecily's eyes did not waver. "I told you the truth. I didn't poison him. You did not, but you were not the only one who wanted Edwin Lavington silenced." Poirot moved toward Eleanor now. "Mademoiselle Dacre, you found the file. You read just enough to know it was explosive. You returned it, but not before realizing how many lives it could destroy, including yours. You were closer to the experiments than you admitted, were you not?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I typed the reports," she said softly. "Back then, I was young. I didn't understand what I was recording until years later. And by then, it was too late," Poirot said. "You stayed close to Edwin all these years, hoping to prevent exposure. But even you didn't expect him to bring it all to light now." He turned at last to Giles Morton. "Monsieur Morton, you have remained, throughout all of this, the least questioned. You are clever, cautious. You kept your movements limited, your words few. But one thing betrays you." Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded linen napkin. Inside it was a crystal tumbler. "This was found hidden in your luggage. It is identical to the glass Edwin Lavington was known to use, but missing from the scene. It contains traces of aged port and a chemical binding agent used to deliver certain medications in liquid form. Not lethal, but potent. Enough to cause disorientation, muscle slackening, perhaps even enough to give the appearance of peaceful death." Giles didn't move. It was not murder. Poirot's voice sharpened. "No? You entered his study. You shared a drink. You laced his port with a substance that would mimic natural failure. You retrieved the second glass and left through the garden window, hoping it would appear as though he had died alone." Smiling. A long silence followed. The fire crackled. Giles finally leaned forward, elbows on knees. He was going to destroy everything we built. The Institute, its future, its reputation. He didn't understand that confession wasn't noble. It was annihilation. "You speak as though you were protecting something," Poirot said coldly. "But you were protecting yourself." I was protecting the work, and yes, my name. My name was in the file, not as a doctor, but as a funder. My family paid for those trials. Edwin only remembered that recently. He told me he was going to expose everyone, no exceptions. So you staged his death, Poirot finished. Giles nodded. He asked me to join him for a drink, to make peace. He said he was ready to forgive the past, even mine. That smile, when he looked at me, it was real. And I gave him something to help him die gently. I thought it was mercy. He died without pain. He died believing I was there to make amends. Poirot looked down. You gave him death in exchange for silence. A long pause followed. No one spoke. Then Poirot turned to the others. Justice will now take its course, but let it be known, truth, like guilt, does not rot quietly. It waits, even for decades, and when it rises, it does not forget. He bowed his head slightly, then turned toward the window, the wind picking up faintly beyond the glass. The smile that Edwin Lavington wore in death had been mistaken for peace, but now, at last, it could be seen for what it truly was. A farewell to silence. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape night returned to Bellemere's like a curtain slowly drawn over a finished play. Yet the players remained on stage, silent, breathless, not quite ready to exit. Poirot's confrontation in the library had struck its mark with surgical precision. No one had spoken since Giles Morton's quiet, damning admission. Even after the group dispersed to their rooms, the air of finality had not settled. Something still rippled beneath the surface. Poirot, ever attuned to the subtle shift of atmosphere, felt it in the floorboards, in the hush of servants' footsteps, in the way shadows stretched differently now through the corridors. The truth had been revealed, yes, but the end had not yet arrived. It was close to midnight when the silence broke. A crash echoed down the West Wing corridor, a sound sharp enough to startle Poirot from his writing desk. He stood, listening. A second sound followed, the hurried slam of a door. Poirot was already at the hallway when a maid appeared from the stairwell, her eyes wide. "Sir, Mr. Morton's room." "The window, he's gone." Poirot didn't rush. He moved with the calm of a man who had already considered this possibility, who had expected, even predicted, that the unraveling was not yet complete. He made his way down the West Wing corridor and entered Giles Morton's guest room. The window had been forced open. The curtain blew faintly in the night breeze. A leather satchel lay overturned on the bed, its contents hastily emptied, its flap torn at the buckle. There was no doubt about it, Giles Morton had run. Within minutes, the household had stirred. Julian appeared barefoot in the hallway, pulling on a dressing robe. Eleanor arrived moments later, her hair down, her face tight with apprehension. Vivian hovered at the stairwell, asking nothing, but watching everything. Poirot summoned the groundskeeper and instructed him to check the rear road and the path leading down to the eastern boundary. Then, without raising his voice, Poirot said, "He will attempt to flee by the old gate, the one behind the stables. Have a man stationed there." Julian looked bewildered. "But why run? He's already confessed." Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Not fully. The truth he gave us was shaped, controlled. He admitted to staging a death, but not to murder. And now, with the police due by morning, he fears what more might be discovered if he stays." Eleanor frowned. "You mean he lied?" "Not entirely," Poirot said, "but he omitted something vital. The exact method, perhaps, or the source of the chemical. He wishes to vanish before anyone can dig deeper." And indeed, Morton had vanished well. For nearly half an hour, no sign of him appeared. Poirot waited in the front hall, his watch in hand, his eyes occasionally drifting to the grandfather clock that stood sentry by the door. Outside, wind rustled through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl cut the quiet. Then, a shout, followed by hurried footsteps. The groundskeeper returned with another man in tow, one of the stable boys. Between them, under the lantern's glow, was Giles Morton, his coat torn at the shoulder, mud streaked up his legs. He did not resist, but his eyes held a sharpness now, like an animal that had bitten through its leash only to find no exit beyond the fence. Poirot stepped forward, quietly. "You have given me your confession, monsieur, but you left out something." Giles said nothing. His breath was shallow. He looked not defeated, but cornered. "You told us Edwin asked to share a drink, that he forgave you. But that was not the moment of death, was it?" Poirot's tone remained calm. It was afterwards, when he turned his back, when he said he would release the file. Still Giles said nothing, but his hands clenched, white-knuckled at his sides. Poirot continued, "You didn't intend to kill him, not at first, but when he made it clear the file would be sent regardless of your presence. That was when you acted. You used a compound designed to simulate cardiac arrest, a blend of sedative and a paralytic agent, quick, nearly invisible, and you waited until he was seated, alone, vulnerable." "You can't prove that," Morton whispered. "But I can," Poirot replied softly. "The glass you hid contains residue of succinylcholine, a muscle relaxant with a short half-life. Nearly impossible to trace after a few hours unless one knows where to look. But your glass, carefully hidden, not washed, preserved the truth." Morton looked down. Poirot stepped closer. "You said he died smiling, but it wasn't peace. It was paralysis, the muscles of the face, the last to freeze. You saw it and mistook it for acceptance, but it was stillness, a final, silent protest." The words hung like cold iron. Poirot stepped back and nodded toward the butler, who had arrived just in time with 2 officers from the local station, finally summoned properly. "I trust you will accompany them quietly, monsieur." Giles Morton raised his chin once, then allowed himself to be led away. As the doors shut behind them, Poirot remained standing in the hall, the firelight flickering against his waistcoat. He did not speak again for some time. Only when the last footsteps had faded did he finally turn to Eleanor, who stood nearby, tears brimming silently in her eyes. "Truth, mademoiselle," he said gently, "is never late, but it does not always arrive kindly." Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The rain returned the next morning, soft and steady, as if Bellemere's itself needed a ritual cleansing. Mist clung low over the hedgerows, and the old stone walls of the manor looked darker, more ancient, as though stained by the night's unraveling. Poirot stood in the east drawing-room, hands behind his back, gazing out through the tall windows into the drenched gardens beyond. He had not slept. He rarely did when the case had reached its final hours, not when the last pieces were beginning to fall, clicking into place like the teeth of an invisible lock. Giles Morton was now in police custody. His confession was written, signed, and sealed. He had admitted to administering a paralytic compound in the port, staging Edwin Lavington's death to appear peaceful, natural, and yet, for Poirot, something had remained just slightly out of place. The manner of Giles' escape, his attempt to flee, was not panic. It was strategy. It had all the signs of a man attempting to delay something, not merely escape punishment. It nagged at him. Why flee after having already confessed? Vivian Hargrove entered the drawing-room quietly, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. Her expression was drawn but composed. "He'll be charged?" she asked. "Yes," Poirot replied without turning. "The evidence is sufficient. The motive, perhaps more so." Vivian was silent for a while, then spoke again. "Do you think he was truly remorseful?" Poirot turned now, studying her. "No. I think he was proud, not of the killing but of the control he maintained. Even in guilt, he remained the architect of his own narrative. That is why he staged the death with such delicacy, why he smiled when he spoke of Edwin's peace. She looked down. And yet Edwin suffered, didn't he? Poirot hesitated. Only briefly. But yes, he suffered in silence. Vivian's fingers clutched her shawl tighter. Then, "May I show you something?" She led Poirot not to her room, but to the old sitting room near the library, Edwin's favorite space in the house. The room was untouched since his death. Books still piled on the side table, a pair of reading glasses perched on the armrest of his chair. Vivian crossed the room and retrieved a small journal from beneath a floorboard panel, hidden expertly beneath a warped corner of carpet. "I found this after the police searched," she said. "It was meant for me. He told me, years ago, that if anything ever happened to him, I should check the sitting room." Poirot opened the journal slowly. The handwriting was unmistakably Edwin's, neat, intelligent, often underlined. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger of conscience. The first entries were brief, mentions of the Institute's funding, odd anomalies in the early patient records. Then more disturbing notations, protocols that had been falsified, drug trials accelerated without consent, references to patients referred to only by numbers. Poirot turned the pages slowly, and then he saw it. Patient 4, a long paragraph, scribbled hurriedly, unlike the others. He never spoke after the second injection. They said it was an anomaly, psychogenic mutism perhaps, but I believe it was something else. A choice. He had seen something he couldn't name. "I reviewed the files last week. The doses were doubled without my approval. The man they buried was not the man we admitted." Poirot's fingers tightened on the page. Below the entry, in smaller handwriting, a single line. "GM approved the override." "Giles Morton," he murmured. Vivian nodded. He wasn't just a funder. He was on the internal board. He had the power to push protocols forward. Edwin only realized it after reviewing the archives this spring. That's when he changed. That's when he decided to expose everything. Poirot closed the journal gently and let out a breath. This was the final piece. The truth Giles feared most, that he hadn't simply facilitated questionable science. He had sanctioned abuse, the kind that left a man without a voice. Vivian looked toward the fireplace. "Do you think Edwin wanted to forgive him?" Poirot was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I think Edwin knew he was not long for this world. He wanted to forgive what he could and reveal what he couldn't. But forgiveness, mademoiselle, is not an erasure. It is a light cast on truth, not a shadow drawn over it." Later that day, Poirot stood again in the study where it had all begun. The chair remained empty. The note still lay preserved in a folder, its words clear and strange as ever. "I forgive what cannot be repaid." Now finally, Poirot understood. Edwin Lavington had not written it as absolution. He had written it as warning. He had known someone would try to silence him, and he had made certain that, even in death, he would be heard. Poirot looked to the desk one last time, then turned away. The affair had begun with a smile, but it would end with a reckoning. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. By the time the sky cleared over Bellemere, the house had fallen into a strange, anticipatory quiet. Like a stage after the actors have taken their places, the script already written but not yet read aloud. The servants moved with a gentler hush. Conversations were short and drifting. Word had spread that Hercule Poirot would speak once more that evening, gathering the remaining guests for a final explanation. There would be no evasions, no half-truths. This time, it would all be said aloud. The library was prepared once again. Chairs arranged in their now familiar circle. The fire lit but low. It cast long, thoughtful shadows across the spines of the books and across the strained expressions of those who entered, one by one. Vivian arrived first, followed by Eleanor Dacres, her posture stiff and guarded. Julian Lavington took a seat near the far edge, silent, visibly weary. Cecily Venn entered last, clutching a notebook as though it were armor. The only absence was, of course, Giles Morton. He remained in custody, removed from the house, but not from the conversation. Poirot stood at the center of the circle, hands gently laced, eyes lowered for a moment before lifting to meet them. "Mes amis," he began, "you have each played a role in this affair, not all equal, but all essential. And tonight we gather not only to reflect upon a crime, but to understand the forces behind it. A death is never only the act of a hand. It is the culmination of choices, silences, and shadows cast across time." The room was still. The fire cracked once and then again, but no one moved. Poirot walked slowly across the carpet, his tone soft but precise. "We believed at first that Edwin Lavington died peacefully. A smile upon his face, a note of cryptic forgiveness nearby. And yet, the moment I saw that smile, I knew something was wrong. It was not contentment. It was stillness. A stillness too perfect." He turned to face Julian. His own son delivered the tea, unaware that the drink had already been tampered with, laced with a paralytic agent intended to immobilize without leaving a trace. Giles Morton confessed to that much, but he did not confess everything. What he hoped to hide was this. He did not act out of spontaneous fear. He had known, for weeks, what Edwin planned. Poirot reached into his coat and held up the recovered journal. "This," he said, "is what Giles sought to silence. Edwin Lavington had compiled it quietly, hidden it deliberately. It reveals not only the past crimes of the Institute, but the complicity of those who funded, directed, and buried the outcomes. Among them, Giles Morton. His initials appear in marginal notes authorizing experimental overrides, one of which led to the irreversible mental collapse of a patient known only as 4. A soft gasp escaped from Eleanor Dacres. Cecily's eyes, too, widened, but she said nothing. Poirot continued. "It was Edwin's intention to make this ledger public, but he delayed its release, not out of doubt, but out of mercy. He sent invitations. He wanted those involved to hear the truth first. To face it together." Poirot turned now to Eleanor. "You knew what the file contained. You helped write those reports, though perhaps you did not understand their consequences at the time. You feared exposure, but you did not kill. You watched. You hoped Edwin would relent. To Cecily, you feared for your father's name. You tampered with the tea to delay the meeting, to buy time, not to silence. But even that small act, done in fear, nearly made you complicit." Cecily looked down at her notebook. Her voice, when it came, was hushed. "I didn't know how deep it went. I thought he was angry at the Institute, not trying to dismantle it." Poirot nodded gently. "And Julian, you thought your father had summoned you only to scold or shame. But what he wanted, truly, was to make peace. You were to inherit not wealth, but knowledge. A truth. He hoped you would be strong enough to carry it forward." Julian blinked rapidly, his lips parting without sound. Poirot stepped back to the center. The murder was not one of passion. It was not even one of hatred. It was a murder of preservation, of legacy. Giles Morton believed that if Edwin's voice was silenced, the story could remain buried. But what he forgot, what all men like him forget, is that the truth, once prepared, cannot be unspoken. It waits, it lingers, and it finds a way. For a moment, no one breathed. Poirot placed the journal on the table. "I will see to it that this is published," he said quietly. "Anonymized where needed, full where justice demands. The veiled protocol, the patience, the funding lines, they will not disappear. Not this time. Vivian stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. And what about Edwin's smile? Poirot looked toward the fire. It was the last part of him left untouched by the drug. But I believe he smiled because he knew the truth would survive him. He had done all he could. And perhaps, in his final moment, he forgave not the past, but himself. A silence settled again, but it was no longer heavy. It was the kind that followed clarity. Poirot gave a final bow, then turned and walked from the room, his footsteps quiet on the parquet floor. Behind him, Bellemere remained still, but no longer mute. The truth had found its voice, and it would not smile for silence again. Chapter 16. The reveal. The evening air at Bellemere's had settled into a hushed expectancy. The manor's ancient walls seeming to lean closer as Hercule Poirot prepared to deliver his final reckoning. The remaining guests had gathered once more in the library, each seat filled by figures marked by exhaustion and apprehension. Shadows danced in the firelight, flickering against the shelves lined with dusty tomes, as though the very history of the house itself awaited the unveiling of truths long buried. Poirot stood at the room's center, his presence calm but commanding. He regarded each face with a quiet intensity, as though seeking to pierce the veils that each had drawn around themselves. The moment had arrived to lay bare the intricate web of motives, lies, and betrayals that had culminated in Edwin Lavington's death. "Mes amis," Poirot began, voice steady yet solemn, "we have journeyed together through a labyrinth of half-truths and silence. Tonight I will recount what the little grey cells have uncovered. Not merely the how of death, but the why, the human heart's tangled motivations behind it." He paused, eyes sweeping across the group before resting on Giles Morton's empty seat, a reminder of the absence felt so keenly. Edwin Lavington was a man burdened by conscience. His discovery of the Institute's darkest chapters, experiments conducted without consent, lives forever altered, shattered him. He wished to atone, to expose, and perhaps to forgive. Yet forgiveness is a fragile thing, especially when so many lives are entwined in the shadow of those secrets. Turning toward Julian, Poirot's voice softened. "You believed your father was a distant man, a disappointment, but he sought to bridge that gap. He wanted you to carry forward the truth. He entrusted to you a legacy heavier than gold." Julian's eyes glistened, but he remained silent. Poirot then looked at Cecily. "You tried to protect your father's name, acting out of fear and love, not malice. Your tampering was a desperate act to delay the inevitable, yet it also entangled you in the consequences of the past." Eleanor's gaze remained steady as Poirot addressed her. "You knew too much and feared exposure. Your closeness to Edwin allowed you to witness both his resolve and his torment. You are part of the story, not just a bystander." A subtle tension rippled through the room as Poirot's attention settled on Vivian. "You, raised by Edwin after tragedy, carry the weight of his hopes and regrets. Your quiet strength contrasts with the shadows you have both endured." He took a deep breath, then with deliberate clarity shifted focus to Giles Morton's role. "Monsieur Morton, you were more than a trustee. You wielded influence over the Institute's direction, over decisions that altered human lives irreparably. When Edwin threatened to expose those actions, you chose to silence him." Poirot's gaze was unyielding. "You gave him a drink laced with a paralytic agent, succinylcholine, designed to simulate natural death. You hoped to disguise murder as mercy. But the hand that shakes with guilt cannot erase the truth." He paused to let the weight of his words settle, then added, "The smile that remained on Edwin's lips was not peace, but paralysis, a cruel mask of the final moments." The guests exchanged glances, the tension thickening. Poirot lifted the journal, Edwin's ledger of dark confessions, and held it reverently. This document is the cornerstone of justice. It reveals the protocols, the abuses, the complicity of many. It is not merely Giles Morton who stands condemned, but the entire system that permitted such shadows to grow. He placed the journal on the table and stepped back. Yet, despite these sins, Edwin sought forgiveness, not in vengeance, but in truth. His final note, "I forgive what cannot be repaid," was a message to us all, a call to remember that justice is tempered with mercy, and that silence is often the greatest crime. The room remained silent, the flicker of the firelight echoing the flicker of realization on each face. Poirot's voice softened. "Let this be a lesson. That the past cannot be buried forever, that truth finds its voice, and that even the smallest acts of courage can illuminate the darkest corners." He bowed his head briefly, then looked up. Justice will now proceed through proper channels. The law will determine the fate of those involved. But in this house, tonight, truth has been restored. As the guests absorbed his words, a weight seemed to lift, slowly, tentatively, replacing dread with a fragile hope. The affair that had begun with a chilling smile had found its resolution not in silence, but in revelation. Poirot turned toward the door, the soft rustle of robes and quiet footsteps following his departure. Outside, the rain had ceased. Dawn's first light would soon touch the gardens of Bellemere, promising a new beginning, born of old truths, finally told. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The dawn that crept over Bellemere's carried a fragile quietness, a muted calm that seemed to hover hesitantly, as if the manor itself was not yet certain the storm had passed. The night had been long, weighted with confessions, confrontations, and the slow unraveling of secrets buried for decades. Now, in the soft morning light, the heavy cloak of suspicion began to lift, though the consequences of the past remained firmly in place, shaping what would come next. In the great hall, the remaining guests gathered once more, their expressions a mix of relief, exhaustion, and somber reflection. Giles Morton was gone, escorted by the police, his fate sealed but the echoes of his actions reverberating throughout the house. Each person present had faced their own truth in the wake of Poirot's revelations, and the burden of that truth hung palpably in the air. Yet justice in its purest form was not only about punishment. It was about resolution and, where possible, redemption. Poirot moved among them with his characteristic grace, offering quiet words where needed, a nod of understanding, or simply the solemn acknowledgement of shared experience. To Julian, he spoke softly of hope, not of inheritance, but of the strength to carry on with purpose beyond material wealth. To Vivian, he offered reassurance that Edwin's legacy would not be forgotten, and that the truth she had helped uncover was a beacon, not a burden. Eleanor Dacre and Cecily Venn shared a moment across the room, two women bound by fear and courage alike, standing now as witnesses to history rather than its silent victims. Poirot caught their glances and offered a subtle smile, a silent encouragement for the difficult road ahead. As the morning progressed, the formal arrival of the local magistrate and additional officers brought an official air to the proceedings. Giles Morton was formally charged with manslaughter and conspiracy to obstruct justice, based on the evidence Poirot had meticulously gathered. The documents, the chemical residue, the testimonies, each piece had been assembled with care, forming a clear narrative of guilt that no court could ignore. Before departing, Poirot requested one final meeting with the family in the library. It was here that he spoke not as a detective, but as an observer of human nature, offering reflections that sought to comfort, even as they acknowledged the harshness of truth. Edwin Lavington's life and death are a testament to the complexity of conscience, Poirot began. His voice gentle but unwavering, He carried burdens not of his own making, but chose to face them. The smile he wore in death was not a mask of peace, but of acceptance of the consequences of truth and the hope that justice, though delayed, would prevail. He looked around the room, meeting each gaze with calm sincerity. Justice is rarely swift, it is rarely simple, but it is necessary, not only to punish, but to heal, to offer a chance for those left behind to rebuild with honesty and courage. Julian, standing quietly near the window, nodded slowly. I understand now what my father wanted me to have. Not wealth, but clarity. A path forward. Poirot smiled. And that is the greatest inheritance of all. As the family and remaining guests dispersed, preparing to leave Bellemare and return to lives forever altered, Poirot lingered for a moment in the study. The room felt emptier now, yet charged with the echoes of confession and courage. He looked once more at the folded note still tucked away, the final whisper of Edwin's will. "I forgive what cannot be repaid," Poirot murmured softly, a mercy granted from beyond the veil. With a final glance round the room, Poirot turned and stepped toward the door. Outside, the sun had broken fully through the clouds, casting a warm light across the gardens. Bellemere's seemed to breathe anew, as if shedding the weight of its secrets. Justice had been served, but more than that, a reckoning had been faced with grace. And as Poirot walked away from the manor, his steps light but purposeful, he carried with him the quiet knowledge that in the complex dance of truth and lies, the little grey cells had triumphed once more. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The sun was setting as Hercule Poirot stood on the terrace of Bellemare, gazing out over the gardens that had witnessed so much whispered conversation, so many hidden glances, and ultimately a death that had spoken louder than any voice. The sky was a tapestry of amber and violet, the last light casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and fold over the house itself, as though nature were drawing a curtain on this long, tangled drama. Behind him, the manor was alive with quiet movement, servants preparing for the evening, the last guests gathering their belongings, and somewhere within its walls, the weight of justice being set into motion. Giles Morton was now in the hands of the law, his fate sealed by the meticulous work of Poirot's little grey cells and the bravery of those who had faced their truths. The shadows had been banished, but not without leaving their marks. Poirot's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of a puzzle completed, yet his expression remained as composed and serene as ever. He had watched the threads pull taut, the delicate dance of human frailty and strength, and in the end he had seen the whole tapestry. Turning slowly, he saw Julian Lavington approaching. The young man's face was more settled now, no longer marked by the restless guilt and despair that had haunted him. There was something lighter in his step, a hint of purpose. "Monsieur Poirot," Julian said quietly, "thank you for uncovering not just the truth, but for showing me how to carry it." Poirot smiled gently. "Mon ami, truth is a burden only if one refuses to bear it. Your father knew this. That is why he smiled in death, not because he was at peace, but because he had passed the torch." Julian looked toward the gardens, the fading light reflecting in his eyes. "I will not waste it." Poirot's gaze drifted back to the horizon. And that, perhaps, is the greatest justice we can hope for. As twilight deepened, Poirot turned to leave the terrace and make his way to the waiting car. He paused, placing a hand lightly on the wrought iron railing. His voice carried softly on the evening breeze, as if offering a final reflection not just to those within earshot, but to the world itself. "Human nature," he said, "is as complex as the mysteries we seek to solve. It is full of shadows and light, of secrets kept and confessions whispered, but always it is the little grey cells, the mind's quiet logic, that must guide us through the darkness. With a nod to the fading sun, Hercule Poirot stepped down from the terrace. The manor behind him, the case resolved, he walked toward the road with the elegant certainty of a man who had, once again, restored order to chaos. And the smile that had haunted the halls of Bellemere's was no longer a mystery, but a testament to courage, to truth, and to the enduring power of justice. The amber light of the dying day clung to the ancient stones of Bellemere's, casting long, quivering shadows that stretched like ghostly fingers across the gardens. The manor, a silent sentinel to secrets whispered and sins buried beneath polished veneer, now stood at the precipice of closure and revelation. The weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, an intangible presence as palpable as the creeping twilight. Hercule Poirot, standing alone on the terrace, allowed his gaze to wander beyond the manicured hedges to the dense woods where light gave way to impenetrable darkness. The night was a tapestry woven from threads of mystery, some vibrant with truth, others shrouded in deceit. He knew well that beneath the surface of even the most elegant facades, shadows gathered, twisting in endless dance with light. The case of Edwin Lavington had been no ordinary puzzle. It was a labyrinth of silence and whispers, where every smile hid a story, every glance concealed a motive. A death so serene it seemed a cruel artifice, the final act of a man who had learned that the truth, once unearthed, could not be unspoken, even by silence itself. And yet, it was the shadows, those unspoken words, the veiled intentions, that had truly spoken. Behind him, footsteps approached, measured, tentative. Julian Lavington emerged from the doorway, his figure outlined by the flickering glow of candlelight spilling from within. The young man's face bore the traces of a night spent wrestling with grief and revelation, but beneath it lay something more, a fragile hope born from understanding. "Monsieur Poirot," Julian said quietly, "I find myself unmoored by the past and uncertain of the future. Yet you have shown me a path, one that begins not with denial, but with acceptance." Poirot turned, eyes softening like dawn breaking through mist. "Mon ami, the past is a shadow that can lengthen or shorten with the light of truth. Your father knew this when he smiled, not out of peace, but out of a resolve that the story must continue." Julian's gaze drifted toward the creeping dusk. "I will carry that story, not as a burden, but as a beacon." The detective inclined his head. "And therein lies justice." The night deepened, swallowing the sun's last embers. Poirot turned away from the terrace, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone path that led toward the awaiting motor car. The mansion loomed behind him, a vast repository of whispered confessions, shattered illusions, and silent reckonings. Each window held a flicker of light, like watchful eyes guarding the fragile peace now restored. His mind, ever the labyrinth of logic and reflection, traced the contours of the case. Each clue, each misdirection, each subtle gesture woven into the fabric of human frailty and will. The smile that had haunted the corridors was no longer a cipher of dread but a symbol of defiance against the silence death often demands. As he paused at the edge of the garden, Poirot's voice drifted into the night like a spell cast to bind the shadows. "Human nature is an enigma wrapped in riddles, a maze of light and darkness. Within it dwells the eternal struggle between concealment and revelation, between the whispered lie and the shouted truth. It is the little gray cells, those quiet sentinels of reason, that must navigate the labyrinth, illuminating the unseen and unraveling the concealed." A cool wind stirred the leaves, carrying the scent of rain and earth, the perfume of secrets half told. Poirot's silhouette merged with the gathering dusk, a solitary figure poised between the worlds of mystery and justice, reason and intuition. With measured grace, he stepped onto the road leading away from Bellemere's, the manor shrinking behind him into the shadows of history. The weight of the case eased with each step, replaced by the serene certainty of order restored. And in the stillness, the echo of Edwin Lavington's final smile remained. Not as a riddle, but as a testament to the power of truth, courage, and the enduring light cast by justice. The game was over. The players dispersed, but the story, like the shadows, would linger, waiting for the next moment when the little grey cells must awaken once more. The manor's walls seemed to exhale as Poirot walked away, releasing decades of whispered secrets and silent regrets into the night. Each stone, each pane of glass, had borne witness to a complex human drama where love tangled with fear, truth wrestled with deception, and justice moved slowly but inevitably toward its mark. The echoes of what had passed would remain, shimmering like a ghostly dance beneath the moon's pale gaze. Poirot's thoughts lingered on the fragile balance between mercy and judgment, the fine line where forgiveness meets accountability. Edwin's last smile was not merely the stillness of death, but a quiet defiance against a world that sought to bury inconvenient truths. It was a challenge to all who remained, to remember, to bear witness, and to carry forward the light of revelation. As the road stretched before him, winding through darkened woods and mist-veiled fields, Poirot felt the steady pulse of the little grey cells, the ever-watchful guardians of reason and insight. Wherever shadows gathered, wherever silence cloaked the guilty, they would stir again, ready to unravel the mysteries concealed beneath the surface of human nature. And thus, the eternal game of detection would continue.